Thanksgiving had always been my grandfather's favorite holiday, and so I did not think it especially strange when, weeks after his condition had begun to deteriorate, and hours before we had planned to visit him, he showed up at our house, standing unassisted in the doorway and flanked by a man none of us had seen before. When he entered, my grandfather crossed the boundary in a single step, causing my mother to back away from the door in surprise. "I'm feeling very good today," he said as he embraced her. Then, with a wave of his arm, he beckoned his companion inside. "This is Fraser. He's been taking care of me." Fraser was a much younger man than my grandfather, and yet his greetings, however warm, appeared so much less vibrant. My grandfather moved about my extended family like a memory come to life. When it was my turn, his thin arms surrounded me with the strength one would expect of a younger veteran. "Good to see you again, Isaac." I hugged him back. While the rest of us set the table, my grandfather regaled us with war experiences and stories of old carving projects. They were topics I had heard him speak on frequently, though all of the events he now related were new to me. Upon hearing his description of a small wooden owl he had crafted for my then-teenage mother as a gift to a boy she liked, she turned to him. "I completely forgot about that." "I kept it," he said. "It's in the old house, in the attic." She shook her head, laughing. Fraser watched my grandfather in silence. Fraser seemed friendly enough, answering questions when prompted. He was a priest, and one of my grandfather's primary caretakers. He had no family in town and could not take the time to travel all the way to California. My grandfather's condition had been especially good today, and so he had been allowed to leave. Yet he offered nothing freely and only spoke when spoken to. This rubbed Aunt Dana the wrong way, and I caught her throwing the occasional disapproving glance toward him. For all that, Fraser was a guest, and we were grateful that he had been attending to my grandfather, who spoke enough for them both. He was still telling stories when it came time to sit at the table, and sat down next to me while describing the boat he had carved out of a tree some storm had cut down. It was only when my mother announced that it was time to say grace that he stopped. We reached for each other's hands, and almost formed a circle. But my grandfather did not join us. "Fraser is a priest," he said. "I think it would be appropriate for him to lead us." At once, Aunt Dana grumbled. "A priest? I've been saying grace since I was 10. I don't need a priest to tell me how to say grace." But my mother shushed her and handed the ritual over to Fraser. He clasped his hands together in front of his face, and at his instruction we did the same. Closing his eyes, he told us to follow suit, and then, once we were all ready, he began saying aloud the Lord's Prayer. Soon after he had started, the rest of us joined, like a hushed cannon in a chorus. "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." Yet, as the prayer went on, a feeling of anxiety grew in me. The words were correct. Our hands were not in their regular positions for Thanksgiving night, but I had prayed so frequently on my own that this change was insufficient to explain my growing suspicion that something was wrong with the scene. I opened my eyes and looked around. My grandfather had assumed the appearance of prayer, closing his eyes and clasping his hands together so that, even if the other family members had opened their eyes, it would be only from the seats next to him that they would be able to see that his lips weren't moving. I stared at him, and completed my prayer purely through muscle memory. It baffled me, even after Fraser had finished and the conversation had started again in earnest. I did not bring it up out of politeness, for he and my mother and everyone else seemed so happy. But throughout the night it stuck with me that the man whom I had heard pray whenever the situation called for it would be silent at this time. I laughed at his jokes regardless and was glad he had come, but there was always the lingering, vague sense of wrongness, which only intensified when I realized how strange it was that he was even here. Time passed, and my grandfather never diminished or lost the energy that had carried him over the doorframe. He ate and never seemed to fill. He drank and it never seemed to dull his faculties. By 11, he had eaten thirds and had asked every member of our extended family about every facet of their lives. He was on his 4th war story when Fraser, who the whole time had remained silent whenever one of us had not spoken to him, placed a hand on his shoulder. "It is getting late," he said. My grandfather attempted to wave him away. "A few more minutes." "Darren," said Fraser, firmer this time, "it is getting very late." My grandfather paused. He asked my mother for the time, and was informed that it was 11:30. Then, with the utmost reluctance, he slowly peeled himself out of his chair. He said his goodbyes to everyone individually, drawing out each one, with an especially lengthy hug reserved for my mother. Then he and Fraser walked outside. My curiosity was too great to just let him go, and so I alone followed them. They had parked their car some ways down the road, and were halfway to it when, hearing my voice, they turned. I approached them, intending to do something, but finding myself at a loss when I stood next to them. "Yes, Isaac?" I said I wanted to say goodbye again. I was not lying, exactly. He looked at me, and to this day I still wonder what, precisely, he thought when he saw through my excuse. We stared at each other. Then, reaching into his pocket, he produced an old wood carving knife with a worn-down handle and a dull blade. "I want you to have this," he said as, holding the blade, he gave it to me. "It's a bit damaged, but I think you can fix it up. Try carving sometime. Even just a spoon." I turned it over in my hands, examining it closely. Then I thanked him. We hugged one last time before he entered the car, placing himself in the passenger seat. Fraser drove them away, and one right turn later they were out of sight. An attendant at the nursing home found my grandfather dead the next day, laying in his bed while Fraser kept vigil over him, as my grandfather had requested. It came as quite a shock to my family, and my mother in particular, though not as much to myself, even if I could not explain why. A nameless dread grew in me that day, a dread which only increased when the coroner's report found that my grandfather had died 2 days prior to Thanksgiving. My mother dismissed it. "Mistakes happen," she said as she began planning the funeral, but I was not so certain. She asked Fraser to oversee it, a request to which he agreed. I have seen him bury many members of his congregation since then, but I have never seen him so haunted as during that dreary day in the cemetery. His voice rumbled, so heavy with emotion that to hear its tone, independent of his words, was to become less certain of the risen Christ. My family had no more goodwill for Fraser after that, though they thanked him kindly enough. I alone sought him out after that day, entering the confessional for the express purpose of seeing him. I told him what I had seen that night, at the table. A long pause followed in which he squirmed and struggled, searching for something. When at last he seemed to find it, he spoke the only words he would ever speak on the subject. "Darren loved you and your family more than anything. And more than anything, wanted to see you all one last time." I have tried not to think about what he said, and have come to my conclusions regardless. I grew up to own a business, to carve wood every now and then, to watch my mother be buried in that same cemetery, and to start a family tradition of including one more chair at the Thanksgiving table than was necessary. When my daughter asked what the purpose of it was, I told her it was in case my grandfather chose to join us. He never did, and I never explained further. Now, whenever I walk past the cemetery where my grandfather is buried, I always glance toward the stone that marks his resting place. A small part of me expects one day to see him walking, as I remember him on that night. But more than expect, I hope.